Neither of these works nor this rather untraditional outdoor museum appears on our required works list, but I think it's a good place to dive into our next topic, environmental art or in situ art, that is, art very much tied to a particular place, even when, as in the case of the gates, it's only there for a brief period. What draws our eye to these abstract minimalist works is not just their stark shapes, but the exquisite natural setting where they've been installed. So before we get to our first required work, I want to pause for a moment and think about the difference that setting can make to art. The Storm King Outdoor Art Museum is located in the Hudson River Valley, about an hour north of New York City. I spent a wonderful day hiking those grounds in 2017. Works by 4 of our required artists are installed in the park. None of these is a required work. I've stuck the required work by the artist up in the corner of each slide. But I want to look at these works quickly and think about how the impact and even the meaning of these works changes when they are placed outside, surrounded by nature. As you'll learn a few lessons from now, this artist was a child in Nazi-occupied Poland and a young adult in Soviet-dominated Poland. Her work focuses heavily on human loss and suffering. Her Storm King sculpture is actually composed of casting molds once used by a European weapons manufacturer. So surely this work is somehow about death, sarcophagi after all, and about war and about vulnerability. What strikes me about the environmental setting is that we see and feel the vulnerability of glass houses and people in glass houses to objects that could fall from the sky, like bombs. This artist is famous as a pioneer of video-based art. Again, stay tuned. I'm going to cheat and read from the museum website. The work features some of the elements typical of Pake's interior artificial landscapes: scattered televisions, plastic castings of TV consoles, and representations of the Buddha. In Pake's work, television often represents a landscape of contemporary America, assuming a shrine-like role as it does in modern society. Installed outdoors, waiting for UFO takes on additional significance, suggesting unanswerable questions about the relationship between technology and nature. Old, empty television consoles dropped haphazardly onto the ground appear like technological ruins. Does the work suggest that technology, or its detritus, has overtaken nature or somehow merged with it? This is an earth sculpture created by the architect who won the contest to build the Vietnam Veterans Memorial when she was just a 21-year-old undergraduate at Yale. Maya Lin sculpted this work using soil and gravel at the site, creating a drainage system and planting it with sustainable grasses. The artist names 2 influences behind this work, both of which you should know. Any guesses? One is the Serpent Mound in Ohio, and the other is Japanese dry gardens with their carefully raked piles and paths of snow. And just to round out the full list, here's a work created by Claes Oldenburg and his wife. I actually think it looks less incongruous than most of his works. We're more likely to encounter drainage pipes than giant lipsticks or typewriter erasers when we're walking outside. Okay, now we come to our very own Utah work. I'm showing you this video clip because it includes footage from a documentary the artist made about the work, and also because it gives you a glimpse at a different work by Christo and Jeanne-Claude. So now that you've seen the video, I should mention that Spiral Jetty is back above water. So just in purely formal terms, where does this work belong? What category do we put it in? Well, it's minimalist in design and rather abstract, and yet it is set in nature and intended in some ways to mimic nature. The artist also has a political and social purpose. He wants to draw attention to the natural environment and encourage viewers to venture out into remote places in order to see this art. So just a few more observations. The work of art, like nature itself, is changing over time. Salt incrustation, for example, has turned the black basalt white. Again, the work is sometimes underwater, sometimes above, and it will probably, in time, be reclaimed by the lake. The artistic instruments were 2 dump trucks, a large tractor, and a front-end loader hired in Ogden to haul the 6,650 tons of rock and earth into the lake. So I was curious about the spiral shape. Here's what the College Board says in grading rubric for an earlier question on this work. Smithson was interested in the power of the spiral form both in nature and art long before he arrived at the shores of the Great Salt Lake. Present in forms large and small, spiritual and organic, the spiral is associated with growth, change, and rebirth. But, just to complicate this picture, here's some information I found on a scientific website discussing the work. In the spiral jetty, the gap between the spiral's curves is kept constant, so it's an Archimedean spiral, not the logarithmic spiral usually found in nature, as in a chambered nautilus, a popular symbol of organic growth. This further separates Smithson's jetty from the natural world. I've added some more of the College Board comments from the scoring rubric to round this discussion out. These are sun tunnels by installation artist Nancy Holt, Smithson's wife. And believe it or not, these are also in Utah, near Wendover. The sun tunnels are cited to relate to the sun at the summer solstice, and this harks back to prehistoric art. Remember Stonehenge? On the video, you saw work by installation artists Christo and Jeanne-Claude. Their stated goal is to promote awareness of the environment, rural and urban, by modifying those landscapes with cloth. These environmental art projects are enormously complicated and enormously expensive, especially because they usually require multiple government permits. The artists raise the money for the projects from private sources. They do not seek public funding. So here are a couple of famous examples. And here are a few more of their projects. And since it's a neighboring state, you might be interested to know that a big fight erupted in Colorado over Christo's plan to drape almost 6 miles of fabric over the Arkansas River. The Bureau of Land Management approved the project, and in January 2015, a federal court upheld the approval, but local residents and environmental groups continued to fight the decision. They claimed that Christo's art would despoil an area of great natural beauty. Eventually, Christo pulled the plug on the project. So, it raises an interesting question. Is environmental art actually good for the environment? Does it draw attention to natural beauty, or does it mar it? Robert Smithson hoped that his spiral jetty would capture the passage of time, and he recognized that the work would probably disappear in the end. But Christo's projects are deliberately temporary. What difference does this make to the viewer's response? What does Christo himself say about this? It was in your reading. But I'd also note that both the gates and spiral jetty invite direct participation by walking a path. Does this remind you of any other participatory art from this class? What about circumnavulating a stupa or the Kaaba, or moving through the ambulatory in a Romanesque pilgrimage church to visit altars with relics? Something I think you should keep in mind throughout this unit is that contemporary artists sometimes envy and sometimes try to recapture the spiritual power of earlier art in a less spiritual age. This was part of what attracted Picasso to African masks. He loved not just their clean lines and stylized abstraction, but also the way the wearer assumed a spiritual persona, even a link with gods or ancestors. Many of these artists want to restore this sense of spiritual power or the performance aspect of art, even, again, in a more secular age. You saw this slide back in Unit 1 when I was setting up a comparison between the gates and Stonehenge. August was a long time ago, so let's go back and review. This artwork sparked a great deal of public controversy. Many critics and New Yorkers loved the gates. Many others did not. The quotation on this slide comes from a question and answer session with the artists. Due to space constraints, I've just posted their answers. The fundamental question, however, is the one we also asked back in Unit 1. What is art? Is this temporary installation, which cost millions of dollars to erect and then disassemble, art? How did the artist answer? Read the quote and try to restate this in your own words. And here's another point of view. Why does this critic question the gate's value as art? Again, try to restate his complaints in your own words. What do you think? Do the artist and the critic have similar or different visions of what is art? On to our third work of environmental art. the Vietnam War Memorial. Before we listen to the artist give a short description of her own work, I'd like you to talk briefly about how this work might fit into the tradition of spiritual work such as stupas, temples, and churches. Now let's hear from Maya Lin. Note that the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial combines minimalism, sculptural architecture, and earthworks environmental art into one, I think, very moving package. It also incorporates words, specifically the names of every soldier who died in the war. You need to know the controversial history of this work. The homework gave you the background, and so did the video you just saw. I was curious about the original contest. What was the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, that's the nonprofit that sponsored the memorial, actually looking for when they commissioned this work? So here's what I found. The committee said it was looking for a design that fit these adjectives, and this isn't a full list: harmonious, contemplative, reflective, and conciliatory. The competition booklet concluded with the following passage: "We wish to repeat that the memorial is not to be a political statement and that its purpose is to honor the service and memory of the war's dead, its missing, and its veterans, not the war itself. The memorial should be conciliatory, transcending the tragedy of war." Maya Lin herself described the memorial as a sculpture cut into the earth like a knife. Others have described it as a wound that is closed and healing, which of course still makes it a wound. The setting is incredibly important. One wall points toward the Washington Monument, the other in the direction of the Lincoln Memorial. But those monuments are both white rather than black, which is a major reason the memorial sparked so much controversy. Yet, the polished black granite's mirror-like surface reflects back those who come to mourn and honor the dead. And that makes it perhaps Washington's most participative monument. And finally, you need to know the compromise that was finally reached with the memorial's critics, a compromise that the architect herself strongly opposed. These two more traditional statues, one of soldiers, one of military nurses, were erected on the site. What do you think? Do these detract from the memorial, or do they help heal the wound? Okay, let me admit I've been struggling with how to present our last required work, Narcissus Gardens. Let's start with just looking at it as an installation with moving parts. Think about what the guy who made this video is doing and what this might tell you about the artist's intent. You'll only need to watch about the first 30 seconds. So, what is he doing? He's looking at mirror balls floating through water, but he's also looking at himself reflected in the mirror balls and also in the water. In Greek mythology, Narcissus was a hunter and the son of a river god. He was known for his great beauty and his admiration for his own great beauty. Nemesis, the goddess of divine retribution, lured him to a pool where he saw his own reflection in the water and fell in love with it, not realizing it was merely his own image. Unable to leave the beauty of his reflection, Narcissus lost his will to live. He stared at his reflection until he died. Narcissus is the origin of the term narcissism, a fixation with oneself, often one's physical appearance. So in this garden, we all become Narcissus, right? The installation isn't always created on water, but given the story and water's reflective power, it certainly seems appropriate. In some ways, the term narcissism also sums up this artist's career. When I talked about Jeff Koons, I ended up talking more about the artist than his art. It's hard not to do the same for Yayoi Kusama. Like Koons, she is a relentless self-promoter. Like Koons, she straddles the line between mocking art's increasing commercialism and commercializing and profiting from her own art. Here you see Kusama with her signature polka dot art and the bag she designed for Louis Vuitton. You can get one of those on eBay for about $2,000. Kusama grew up in Japan and trained in traditional Japanese painting. She also suffered from bouts of what she herself describes as mental illness that included visions of herself covered with shapes, including her signature polka dot. In 1957, Kusama moved to New York City and became, by turn, an abstract expressionist, a pop artist, and yes, those are what you think they are, covered with polka dots. Then she became a minimalist and a promoter of performance art gatherings or happenings. In the photo, the artist is the one who keeps her clothes on. Everybody else gets to wear polka dots. Yayoi Kusama became pretty well known in the New York art scene, but she didn't make much money with her art. In 1968, she more or less invaded the Venice Biennale, a very important biennial exhibition of contemporary art that's been running since the late 19th century. She wasn't invited to exhibit. Instead, she set up her mirror balls outside the exhibit and sold them to passers-by. Trick gained her a lot of attention, some would say notoriety. In 1973, the artist moved back to Tokyo, and in 1977, she was admitted to a mental institution where she has continued to live when she isn't attending the increasingly successful exhibitions of her work or selling her fashion accessories. If you have time, you might enjoy this BBC interview with this very interesting